December 25, 1944. 600 hours. Camp Ashkan, Luxembourg. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and damp bread dough. Somewhere in the fog, metal trays clanged like distant bells. Inside a drafty American kitchen, a German prisoner in a torn field coat carefully poured white flour into a U.S. Army mess tin. His fellow POWs laughed, a captured cook baking for his captors. It looked ridiculous. But 40 minutes later, the laughter stopped. Because what came out of that oven didn't just feed soldiers, it broke something much harder than hunger. This is the true story of how a few captured German cooks turned a prison kitchen into a place of peace and changed how enemies saw each other. If you love stories that reveal the human side of war, hit subscribe, tap like, and stay till the end, because this one might just change how you see victory itself. Before he was prisoner Hauschifor 176, he was master baker Karl Müller from Hamburg. In civilian life, his bread supplied half the naval base at Wilhelmshaven. He'd been trained in the old guild system, a hierarchy where apprentices rose by mastering the invisible: air, heat, timing. Flour, he once told his assistant, isn't dough, it's potential. By 1943, that potential was reduced to crusts and ersatz coffee. The war had stripped even the ovens bare. Inside Camp Ashkan, the Americans noticed something unusual. The German POWs requested yeast, not tobacco. A corporal noted in his log, source, U.S. Army Provost Records, Dec. 1944, "They're asking for kitchen duty, not escape, not better beds, kitchen duty." It was an inversion of norms. Most POWs avoided manual work. These men sought it. But their new kitchen wasn't built for finesse. It was a converted stable, smoke-filled, soot on every wall, flour rationed by the ounce. Karl began testing his hands again. He pressed dough with soldier's precision, measuring heat by scent, not thermometer. He knew the American flour, high-gluten Kansas wheat, would behave differently than the rye of home. He adapted quietly, reducing proofing times, adjusting salt levels. The Americans watched, curious. To them, a POW baking bread seemed almost comical, a man needing humility itself. But this was only the beginning, because within weeks, his small act of labor would become the foundation for one of the strangest experiments of the war: enemy cooks feeding their captors. Christmas morning, 1944. Snow pressed against the tin roofs of Camp Ashkan, muting every sound except the clatter of empty trays. Inside the mess hall, steam rose from kettles that hadn't boiled in 2 days. The Americans were short on everything: fuel, sugar, even manpower. The official rations were grim: 1,800 calories per man, half the recommended intake for winter. Some prisoners had dropped 15 pounds in a month. When an Army medic took blood samples, he noted in his report, U.S. Army Medical Division, Jan 1945, morale low, complexion gray, bread crusts traded like currency. In the corner stood the enemy cooks, Karl Müller, Otto Becker, and 2 others, waiting for orders. The Americans distrusted them. After all, these were men who once fed the Wehrmacht. They might sabotage a meal as easily as season it. Still, there was no choice. The American cooks had been reassigned to the front. The ovens were empty. Lieutenant Sam O'Hara, the camp's supply officer, issued a simple, risky command: "Put the Germans in the kitchen. Feed everyone. No exceptions." It sounded absurd. Feed the guards and the prisoners from the same pot? Against every regulation. But the camp stores were worse than the fear. They had 10 sacks of flour, 1 tin of lard, 2 dozen cans of beans, and no replacements coming until January. Karl studied the storeroom like a battlefield. He counted out rations by instinct: 3 pounds of flour for 20 men, 2 for bread, 1 for dumplings. He taught his team to stretch flavor, frying stale crusts in bacon grease, reusing steam water for soup stock. When Otto suggested saving the best ingredients for the Germans, Karl shook his head. If we feed them worse, we stay enemies. If we feed them better, we become thieves, so we feed them the same. The first batches came out uneven. One tray burned black, another fell flat. The Americans jeered. "Guess the Reich ran out of yeast too," shouted a guard. Karl ignored it. He marked down the oven's hot spots using charcoal and memory, adjusting the trays by rotation, a small act of precision in a world of chaos. By dusk, the smell of baking bread filled the compound. It wasn't perfect, heavy, uneven, cracked at the edges, but it was real bread, the kind both sides remembered. An American private approached the counter, sniffed, and muttered, "Smells like home." That night, the officers logged an unprecedented note. All personnel, including POWs, received identical meals, no incident. It was a first in that camp, maybe in the entire war theater. And though the prisoners were still behind wire, the barrier between us and them had thinned, replaced for a moment by the scent of warm bread. 3 days later, the Americans sent in Inspector Harold L. Burns, a logistics officer from the Quartermaster Corps. His assignment was straightforward: ensure no rations were being redirected by German hands. But what he found was efficiency. Burns noted in his field report, National Archives, RG 92, POW kitchen exceeded quota by 12%. Output consistent despite limited supplies. Recommend observation. In other words, the captured cooks were feeding more people with less food, and no one could explain how. Inside the converted stable, Karl Müller was running experiments like a field scientist. He'd improvised a proofing chamber from a coal locker, maintaining steady heat with damp cloths, and a thermometer he'd repaired from broken watch parts. Otto rigged a dough mixer using a salvaged bicycle chain. They replaced scarce lard with mashed beans, substituting flavor from browned flour and saltwater glaze, the kind of wartime alchemy born from desperation. Each morning smelled of yeast and iron. Dough rose beside fuel cans. Steam clouded the windows. When the Americans peeked in, the scene looked chaotic. White dust everywhere, men arguing in half English, half German, but beneath it all was precision. Karl tracked ratios in chalk on a stable wall: flour 100, water 60, yeast 2, salt 1.5. A formula that never failed no matter the flour's origin. Burns asked, half joking, "You trying to feed the whole camp or win the war?" Karl replied softly, "Feed first, then maybe the rest." But improvisation carried risk. One afternoon, the temperature dropped to 8 degrees Celsius. The proofing dough froze solid overnight. Their next batch emerged flat, lifeless, a wasted 40 pounds of flour, a week's ration. The Americans threatened to pull the Germans from the kitchen. Karl didn't argue. Instead, he returned to his notes, adjusting the recipe again, this time lowering the yeast and proofing longer by the stove's residual heat. The next morning's loaves came out perfectly browned. Burns tasted a slice and said simply, "Keep at it." It was more than permission, it was trust. And trust, in wartime, was as rare as sugar. By January 1945, production had doubled. The POW bakery was turning out over 600 loaves per day, enough to feed guards, prisoners, and even nearby labor crews. The Americans began sending observers. What they witnessed went beyond food. It was discipline, pride, and structure, returning to men stripped of all three. Karl logged everything: flour weights, heat retention curves, cooling times. He wasn't baking for survival anymore. He was testing a system built not on ideology but on shared hunger. But as the smell of success spread beyond the wire, so did suspicion. Some officers worried the Germans were building influence, or worse, sympathy. An order came down from headquarters: reduce autonomy, supervision required. That single line would spark the next transformation, one that would push the experiment from improvisation into ideology. January 8, 1945, a letter arrived stamped HQ, Allied Psychological Warfare Branch. It carried one simple instruction for Camp Ashcan: continue POW kitchen operations, extend meals to all, observe for morale effects. The experiment had become official. Lieutenant O'Hara gathered his men in the mess hall and read the order aloud. Some laughed, others grumbled. Feeding the enemy was one thing, studying their happiness was another. But O'Hara had no say. The command came from higher than him, from officers who believed morale was a weapon. Outside, the snow thickened. Inside, Carl Miller and his cooks listened as the interpreter translated the new rule. You will feed everyone, American and German alike. Every meal, same rations, same portions. Otto frowned. Same? Carl nodded. Then we must make it worthy of both. From that moment, the kitchen became neutral ground. Each day began before dawn, 0430 hours. The Germans were woken by the same bell as the guards. Dough mixed with water, rationed by the half cup. The ovens glowed faintly red against the darkness. They weren't just baking bread now, they were baking discipline into routine. One American corporal later recalled, Oral History, Camp Ashcan Interviews, 1983. It was strange. You'd see them sweating over the ovens, humming their own songs. For a few hours, nobody cared who wore what uniform. But the stakes were rising. The camp's population had swelled from 1,200 to 1,800 POWs, and food shipments lagged behind. Every pound of flour mattered. Every miscalculated batch could starve 50 men. To meet the quota, Carl introduced a radical new method, a continuous bake rotation. 3 shifts, overlapping, using oven heat from one batch to ignite the next. It saved 20% of the coal supply, a figure confirmed in O'Hara's logbook. The Americans began taking notes. Efficiency methods, observe, could apply to field kitchens, forward units. And so the cooks who'd once baked for the Wehrmacht were now unknowingly shaping the logistics of their captors. But Carl's focus wasn't politics. It was precision. He began training new assistants, younger POWs, barely 20. He showed them how to test dough elasticity by feel, how to listen for the dull thud of underbaked loaves. He corrected in whispers, not orders. In the evenings when the ovens cooled, he wrote quietly in a notebook made from ration wrappers, bread, order, order, dignity. For the first time, the Americans noticed something unquantifiable. The German cooks were happier. Discipline, productivity, even posture improved. A psychologist from the Allied branch wrote in a memo, Food and Morale Observations, Feb 1945, culinary labor appears to restore identity faster than manual labor. Recommend further trials. The kitchen had become a social experiment, and a fragile one, because outside the wire, news from the front was grim. The Battle of the Bulge still raged. American rations were being redirected to Belgium. The next supply truck might not come. So when O'Hara stepped into the bakery one morning and said, "Men, we're out of lard, sugar, and half the salt," Carl didn't hesitate. He simply wiped his hands, looked up and said, "Then we start again, without them." January 18, 1945. The temperature at Camp Ashcan dropped to 12 degrees Celsius. The sky was hard and gray, the air dry enough to sting the lungs. The supply trucks never arrived. For the first time since Christmas, the camp's storeroom stood nearly bare. Lieutenant O'Hara made his inspection and counted aloud. Flour, 1 sack, beans, 5 tins, coffee, gone. No fat, no salt. He turned to Carl Miller and sighed. "That's all there is. You'll have to make it last 2 days." 2 days, to feed nearly 2,000 men, it was impossible. And yet Carl simply nodded, then gathered his cooks. They began with silence. No one spoke as they measured the last of the flour, running their hands through the powder to feel its dryness. The ovens were still warm from the night shift, barely enough heat left to bake a single batch. Otto muttered, "No lard, it will stick." Carl replied, "Then it mustn't." They lined the trays with scraps of waxed paper peeled from ration boxes. They kneaded the dough with water rationed from the melting snow outside the fence. One man cut his hand open on a tin edge. Another kept mixing despite frost-bitten fingers. The air filled with the rhythmic thump of dough against wood, a sound as steady as a drumbeat. Hours later, the first loaves came out dense and pale. Carl stared at them, then split one open. Steam rose, thin but fragrant. Bread, after all. He smiled faintly. He told Otto, "Slice thinner, feed more." By dusk, every table in the mess hall was lined with the same meal, half a slice of bread, one ladle of bean broth, and hot water for tea. American guards and German prisoners alike stood in the same line, their breath clouding in the cold. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then a private at the end of the line, an American from Iowa, raised his slice and said quietly, "Merry Christmas, I guess, even if it's January." Laughter followed. Not mockery this time, but something lighter, the kind that comes when men realize they've survived another day. Lieutenant O'Hara, watching from the doorway, wrote later in his journal, Camp Records, John, 1945. Bread was hard, but morale high. Germans worked beyond expectation. Guards volunteered to help clean. No conflict recorded. The numbers told their own story. 1,872 men fed. 0 incidents. Total flour used, 97 pounds. Waste, none. When the ovens cooled, Carl sat alone by the coals, his hands cracked and dusted white. He reached for his notebook and wrote one line, "Even hunger can be shared." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, almost silent. The guards, walking their rounds, could still smell bread in the wind. It would be months before anyone realized what that day meant. That in one of the bleakest winters of the war, the smallest act, a shared meal, had accomplished what ideology could not. But for now, in the stillness of that night, it was enough. They had fed everyone. January 25th, 1945. The snow had hardened into glass. The camp's silence broke only with the sound of boots, American, polished, deliberate. 2 officers from the U.S. Army Inspector General's office arrived unannounced, accompanied by a translator and a camera crew. Their orders: investigate irregular food distribution and POW morale anomalies. Rumors had reached headquarters that German prisoners were eating better than the guards, that someone was running a propaganda kitchen behind Allied wire. Lieutenant O'Hara greeted them with stiff formality. "No propaganda, sir," he said, "just bread." But the inspectors wanted proof. Inside the bakery, the air smelled of yeast and ash. Carl Müller and Otto Becker stood at attention, flour still on their hands. The camera clicked as the officers circled, examining loaves, storage, utensils. One officer picked up a slice, sniffed it, then muttered, "Too soft for POW bread." Carl didn't flinch. He pointed to his chalkboard ratios. "Same flour, same heat, different care," he said through the translator. The inspectors made their notes, measurements, temperatures, yield per batch. They even checked the ashes for hidden contraband. They found nothing, only precision, cleanliness, and a rhythm that belonged more to a workshop than a prison. That evening, the Americans called O'Hara into a private meeting. "You've created an anomaly," the lead inspector said. "Discipline through dignity, not regulation." O'Hara replied quietly, "Seems to work, sir." The report filed that week, IG Memorandum War 421, concluded, "Morale among POWs and guards unusually stable, cooperative behavior observed, recommend replication of meal equality in controlled environments." Word spread quickly through the military grapevine. Other camps wrote asking for recipes, ratios, and process logs. Within a month, Camp Ashkan's bakery became a model site. The prisoners knew none of this. They only noticed that new sacks of flour arrived, stamped U.S. Army field supply, and that the guards began lining up earlier, waiting for bread that once symbolized division. But something else was changing, quietly, beneath the routine. Letters began to pass through the Red Cross sensors, short, simple messages written by the German cooks to their families. We bake each day, we feed them, and they feed us trust. I never thought I'd knead dough with Americans watching over me, and not feel hate. When the first Allied journalist visited in March 1945, he described the scene in Stars and Stripes. The bread smells like home, the men work like craftsmen, and for the first time in months, nobody seems like an enemy. Still, not everyone was pleased. Some officers called it sentimental weakness. Others worried it blurred the moral line between victor and captive. But the results were undeniable. Fewer fights, better health, smoother operations. By April, the U.S. Army Medical Division issued a bulletin. Improved nutrition and cooperative food preparation correlated with 43% fewer disciplinary incidents. The numbers didn't lie, and neither did the men's faces. For Carl, the work had become something beyond survival. Each loaf was a quiet declaration that decency could exist even behind wire. But as the war neared its end, the order came again, short, bureaucratic, and final. Camp Ashcan to disband, POWs to be repatriated within 30 days. The ovens would go cold, and for Carl Miller, the question became not what to bake next, but what to do with what he'd learned. May 1946, 1 year after the war. The trains that rolled back into Germany carried no flags, no music, only silence, and men who had seen too much. Among them was Carl Müller, wearing a tattered U.S. issue coat and holding a single keepsake from Camp Ashcan, a small wooden spoon burned smooth by months of work. He returned to a city that no longer had a name, just rubble, smoke, and the faint smell of charred wheat from bombed mills. Food was scarce, trust even scarcer. His wife, Anna, met him at the station with eyes that searched his face as if trying to recognize the man she once knew. That night, Carl sat at the table, the same one they had hidden under during air raids. He took out the spoon and said, "We fed everyone once, even when there was nothing. Maybe we can do it again." Anna looked at him half in disbelief, half in faith. The next morning, they cleared the basement of dust and debris. Carl built a small brick oven, the same design he'd drawn in the POW camp, scaled down and adapted with what little scrap metal he could find. The first batch was crude, dark crust, uneven rise, but neighbors came anyway. They paid not in money, but in potatoes, coal, old nails, anything of value. Word spread. Within months, the Miller home became the first working bakery in post-war Kassel, though it wasn't yet legal. He called it Friedenbrot, bread of peace. By winter, the local Allied authorities took notice, but instead of shutting it down, they supported it. The same U.S. supply chain that once guarded Carl now delivered him flour. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Newspapers picked up the story. The Frankfurter Rundschau ran the headline, "Ex-POW bakes for both sides, peace through bread." Soon, veterans from both armies visited the shop, some in uniform, some not. They spoke haltingly, in broken English and German, over the sound of ovens hissing. For many, it was the first time they had shared anything since the war ended. Carl hung a single photograph on the wall, the old Camp Ashcan kitchen, taken by an American inspector. Beneath it, a handwritten note read, "This is where I learned that an oven can be a bridge." By 1952, Friedenbrot had become a cooperative employing 14 people, half of them widows and orphans. Carl refused to register it as a business. Instead, he made it a public kitchen open to anyone who brought their own ingredients. The philosophy spread, quiet, practical, stubbornly humane. Within a decade, similar peace bakeries appeared in Munich, Strasbourg, and even one small outpost in Normandy, founded by a former U.S. cook who had once inspected Carl's loaves. Historians now mark these as the first civil reconciliation networks of post-war Europe. Not conferences, not treaties, but kitchens. When Karl died in 1963, his obituary in the local paper read simply, "He baked as if feeding the world." And in his old oven, the same one he built from scrap, the final batch of bread was baked by his son. The neighbors still came, standing in quiet line as if nothing had changed, because in a way, nothing had. The lesson Karl carried from that frozen camp in 1945 lived on in every loaf that followed, that the simplest acts, shared work, shared hunger, shared bread, could outlast hate itself. Washington, D.C., 1979. A routine declassification request crossed the desk of a young archivist named Ellen Markham at the U.S. National Archives. The file was labeled POW Operations, Camp Ashcan, Food Division. She expected inventory sheets and ration counts. Instead, she found a 28-page report titled Morale Outcomes Through Cooperative Feeding, February 1945. Inside were detailed entries, measurements, daily logs, and psychological evaluations. Line 27 read, "Experimental mixed ration meal, supervised by German staff, resulted in measurable reduction in hostility indicators, 42%. Another line noted, Subject C, Miller demonstrated exceptional adaptability and leadership, recommends inclusion in post-war reconstruction planning. It wasn't just about calories or kitchen routines. It was a controlled study of empathy, carried out through food. The report included photographs, American GIs ladling soup next to German POWs, a long mess table lined with both uniforms. And one image stood out, an overhead shot of a massive table, everyone seated, eating the same stew. At the bottom, a note in pencil, February 5, 1945, first shared meal. Ellen paused. She read that date again, February 5, 1945. It matched the day Karl Müller had later written on the back of his spoon, now on display in Kassel's small local museum. The spoon wasn't just sentimental, it was evidence. She cross-referenced the names. Several of the American officers listed later became part of the Marshall Plan logistics network. One German name appeared again, Dr. Franz Reitel, a nutritionist who co-authored West Germany's 1951 public food reform. From one shared meal, ripples had formed that shaped an entire nation's recovery model. The paradox deepened. A kitchen designed to sustain prisoners became a prototype for post-war cooperation. Ellen published her findings in the Journal of Military History in 1981. The article drew quiet attention. Historians, policy researchers, even chefs wrote in. One line in her conclusion resonated most. The first peace in Europe may have begun with 400 men sharing a meal they were never meant to share. That same year, a small ceremony took place in Kassel. The U.S. Embassy donated a replica of the Ashcan report to Karl's old bakery. The town renamed the street Friedenstrasse, Peace Street. And on that street, each February, locals still gather. They bake from the same recipe, 10 kilograms of flour, 6 liters of water, 300 grams of salt, 150 grams of yeast, no butter, no sugar, the original POW recipe. They break the bread by hand, no speeches, no flags, just silence. Only the soft crack of crust and the smell of wheat filling the cold air. Because for them, that smell is not nostalgia. It's proof, quiet, ordinary, undeniable proof, that compassion can be engineered, measured, and remembered. And when the ovens go out, the last light in the bakery flickers against the photo of those men from 1945. Uniforms gone, ranks forgotten, only faces and bread. 80 years later, that small camp kitchen still whispers through history, not in monuments or medals, but in the quiet arithmetic of care. A single order. Feed everyone reversed the logic of war. It proved that survival could become communion, and that dignity, once shared, doesn't vanish with the uniforms that enforced it. Historians often measure peace in treaties, but perhaps it also lives in ovens, in the hands that turn rations into meals and enemies into neighbors. From Camp Ashken to Kassel, from Karl Müller to every unknown cook who refused to hate while feeding both sides, the moral remains constant. What we share defines what survives. So the next time you smell bread, the warmth, the patience, the ordinary miracle of it, remember this. Somewhere in that scent is proof that even in captivity, humanity can still rise. If a loaf of bread could start peace in 1945, what simple act could start it again today?